Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 4D PHARMA PLC pre-AGM investor presentation and Q&A. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged. They can be submitted at any time using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Just please type in your question at any time and press send. Given the significant attendance on today's call, the company will not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. Before we begin, we would like to submit the following poll, and your participation would be most appreciated. And I'd now like to hand over to John Doyle, CFO, and Duncan Payton, CEO from 4D PHARMA PLC. Good morning.
Good morning, and thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for joining our first Investor Meet Company event. And given this is the first time we've used this platform, I'll give you a brief intro to 4D PHARMA, its platform, its programs. We'll then move on to our thoughts around the AGM and the requests from the board. And hopefully through the presentation, we'll answer those pre-submitted questions that you guys have asked, and I thank you for those. And at the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask more. So just moving on and thinking about, why we are here and what we're doing. How can a bacteria that we normally associate with disease be used as a drug against something like Parkinson's or cancer, and do that safely? And that's essentially what we're trying to do. We are trying to unlock the power of the microbiome to develop safe and innovative therapies for serious disease. So how do we go about that? How do we unlock the microbiome? You've got 2.5 kilograms of bacteria in your gut. How do we turn that into a drug, which you simply take twice a day in a capsule? And we do that by, very much like every other drug company, we focus on functionality. And we do that by using our MicroRx platform, and we can find that single agent that has a therapeutic effect, just like any other drug company, but opposed to it being a small molecule or a biologic, a protein. It's simply a single strain of bacteria that has a very specific therapeutic effect. And as I've said, we put it in a capsule and you take it once or twice a day. So it's a really easy process for the patient to go through, and we are focusing on drug-like characteristics. So, as I mentioned earlier, we normally associate bacteria with disease. But actually, if you think about the bacteria that we have in our gut, they've developed a specific function in the gut over millennia. And what we're simply doing is unlocking that potential to utilize that specific effect. And because they come from the human gut, we've been able to demonstrate a strong safety profile, in fact, placebo-like, in over 500 patients. And that's really important from our development point of view, because it de-risks the risk of failure because of safety or tox, which is a big issue for industry as a whole. It's really good for patients. It's really good for clinicians, particularly if you can provide a safer alternative, like for example, an asthma, or for a clinician, you can provide a drug to work in combination with a checkpoint inhibitor, for example, as we're doing in oncology, but also looking ahead and being more innovative and thinking about diseases like Parkinson's, where because of that strong safety profile, we may be able to intervene earlier in the development of the disease. And we think that's really important in terms of how we develop the Parkinson's products. So that's the safety aspect. In terms of thinking about serious disease and going back to the vision for safe and innovative therapies for serious disease, it's very clear from the data that we're able to show potential in diseases such as cancer and asthma. So, for example, in oncology, which is the graph on the left, we hit the primary endpoint of clinical benefit early in the development. And this was in patients with really no other treatment options. And it's really important to think about and look at the patients in this group. And this is for renal cell carcinoma, who have responded to a checkpoint inhibitor, but then have stopped responding. And these guys have had multiple lines of therapy. They've had prior failures on those therapies, and the disease is progressing. So their immune system's pretty shot, and they have little or no other options left. So the fact that we see any impact, never mind stable disease for 2 years, is really significant. And if you think about what we saw in asthma earlier this year, we showed that we could improve in the patient the symptoms, and those patients felt better. And you measure that by looking at the ACQ-6 scores, but also there was a reduction in the use of inhalers. So this is the here and now. This is what we're seeing. And in terms of the potential that we have in our clinical pipeline, those programs that are ready for the clinic, whether that be in oncology, looking at getting the first approval for a live biotherapeutic product in oncology, or whether that be going into an early line of therapy like we want to do with Bavencio, or in asthma, building on the already existing data set that we've got within patients and focusing in on a wider patient population to move that into a phase 3 study, or to address diseases such as Parkinson's. There's significant potential within that portfolio. And I think what this slide does is sort of give a hint of that and demonstrates the focus that we have in terms of the priority that we want that we think about our products as we move them on into the clinic. But it's not just the clinical pipeline that has potential. We also have a lot of potential in the platform itself. These products were all developed from the MicroRx platform. So the fact that we have products into the clinic shows the strength of the platform, but also what we can do in terms of other research collaborations, and such as the collaboration that we have with MSD, which is a really technically challenging research program in the development of novel vaccines. And I'm not going to speak in detail about this today. We're going to talk about that research program and other research programs that we've got going on from our research teams in a capital markets day early in the autumn. But this 4D Pharma all generates from the platform, and relationships like Merck, are really important. And we've got other relationships, whether it be MSD or whether it be the Michael J. Fox Foundation, that help us not only understand and help define our clinical programs or our research programs in oncology or Parkinson's, for example, but help push the understanding of the microbiome in industry with biotech and pharma to further demonstrate 4D Pharma's capabilities, like we've done with MSD, and really demonstrate the power of the microbiome. And moving forward, it's really important that more of these are needed. I think the education piece that I referred to earlier in terms of getting the industry to understand the power of the microbiome is really important. And it's a big challenge for us. So whilst the pharmaceutical industry is all about innovation and solving really significant healthcare issues, it's also pretty conservative when it comes to adopting new technologies. But I think 4D Pharma has shown in its ability through its research collaborations and the clinical programs that we've got, we can address these concerns. And more partners are a real key and important part of our strategy going forward, particularly in what are especially challenging market conditions. And I won't labour the general perception that either the biotech market or the microbiome space has underperformed, nor the performance of the main market. But it is exceptionally challenging, as we can show by the graph on the screen. And within that, the deal structures that we're seeing are quite aggressive. They're heavily warranted structures, which impacts the amount of capital you can raise. But also the investors are looking to fund companies through milestones, which, given the nature of trials, is really significant compared to our market cap. So flexibility is key in being able to fundraise, and fundraising and accessing capital when we can in the market really quickly. And I think the board recognizes this. The board continuously thinks about the financing strategy and the issues that we have in terms of the downward pressure on the share price, which is a huge frustration for all our shareholders, including myself. I've invested significant sums of money into the company. I think I've invested over $2 million in the last couple of years. So from a shareholder point of view, I really understand the frustration that people see with the share price. But that pressure that downward pressure on the share price puts pressure on the ability to raise capital. So as we stand today, if we want to raise capital today, we've got a 40% authority. We've got a 45 million market cap. So that would allow us to raise 18 million. But if we're looking at a one-to-one warranted transaction, that actually only generates 9 million sterling of cash from an $18 million share raise. So this is something that we have to think about. And the board recognizes this, but the board also recognizes that in these markets, we need to carefully manage the capital and burden and focus in on our near-term opportunities, as well as giving the company the capacity and flexibility to raise capital when the opportunity is presented. And that's why the board is asking for the authorities that it's asking for. And I think, just talking about the board for a second, I'm very pleased with the board of directors that we have at 4D Pharma. I think they're very focused. I think they're diligent. I think they're professional across all aspects of the business. And I think that's really highlighted by a couple of the recent appointments. I think Katrine not only brings great experience from regulatory and clinical trials in oncology and neurodegeneration, but also has a wealth of experience in working in the Asian markets. And Paul has a long experience in the US markets and US financing, and is an ideal appointment along John, who joined as CFO at the start of the year. So, and I understand the concerns that people have about the board of directors, and, for example, remuneration. The board, as you'd expect, went through a comprehensive benchmarking process when we post NASDAQ. They worked with Radford, who's a leading consultant in life sciences and conversation market intelligence, and looking at that benchmark, they set the benchmark for 4D Pharma at below market average, just to give some context around what's going on. And in terms of that package, in terms of the options that we get, these are market value options. So in terms of the share price, they only have value if the share price is above what the option price, and it's not. It's significantly below. And additionally, these shares also vest over time. So the grant of the options does not give me or the employees any value at the time of grant, but it could do in the future, if we perform, and we're incentivized to see the share price go up. And I think that's the point. I think the board has put in place the appropriate structures that it believes are right to retain and incentivize staff in the long term. And from my personal perspective, in these difficult times, it's really important that we have the right people alongside us to bring us through this difficult period, but also bring through the power of the microbiome. And coming back to where we are, this vision that we have is really becoming a reality. There's a lot of potential in our platform. There's a lot of potential in our pipeline, and there's a lot of potential in our people. And that's what we need to focus in on. And working through these difficult market conditions, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be tough. But we need that flexibility. We need that capability to raise more capital, to really develop and should give that potential, that value to the shareholders in the longer term. So that gives you a flavour of 4D Pharma. It gives you a flavour of what we're talking about at the AGM. Hopefully I've been able to answer a few of the questions that have been posed to us. More than happy to take more questions now, and I'll hand back over to Mark for the Q&A session.
That's great, Duncan. John, thank you very much indeed for updating investors. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of the screen. But that's why John and Duncan take a few moments to review those questions submitted already. I'd like to remind you that recording this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your Investor Meet company dashboard. And just to remind you to submit your questions, there's a Q&A tab, type in your questions and just press send. Duncan, thank you very much indeed. And as you said, you did receive quite a considerable amount of questions, which I think you've categorized, themed, and put into the response through that presentation. So let's go through some of these that we received during the presentation itself. The first one from Sahid, who says, we've seen that the share price of 4D go down from £1.50 from its high of £1.80. Given the progress that you state has happened and the positive results to date, why have we not seen individual investors take positions? And what are the plans to, I guess, increase the share price in the next 6 to 12 months?
I think, that's a great question. And, being an investor myself, it's one of the questions, that I think about a lot. I think if you look at the share price and you look at the general market conditions, I think, for example, when we issued when we put out the renal cell carcinoma data, we saw a big bump in the share price and then it dropped down. And we're seeing that time and time again in the marketplace. For example, Ceres a couple of weeks ago, they put out some good data as they move towards, potentially the first, submission for a BLA. So the first, a big step in the approval process. They saw the share price bounce 40%, and then the next day dropped down 80%, and then dropped down to, below where it started the week before. So I think it's the market conditions are challenging. We really want to see the share price go up. We need to bring in, more investors into the story, longer term investors as well. So, that's what we're working on. We're working with banks in the US. We're working with banks in the UK as well. We're looking at all different types of options in terms of funding, and it's something the board is entirely focused on to, really get the story out there. And I think, partnerships is key to that. Bringing in more people, more pharma companies who want to work with us in the microbiome is going to be key to giving more confidence to investors about the progress that we're making.
That's great, thank you. If I turn to the next question, which reads as follows: any news coming up on any of the ongoing trials?
So, as people will be aware, or they may not be aware, the real priority focus within 4D is 518 with Keytruda being the biggest selling drug in the world at the moment. So we saw some early data in renal cell carcinoma where we hit the primary endpoint early. So we monitor that. We monitor the patient's progress as they progress through the trial. It's not news to everyone that we also are looking at non-small cell lung cancer. So, hopefully we're going to see a similar result to what we saw within renal cell carcinoma in terms of hitting that primary endpoint early. And I think that'll be, a major flagstone for the business in terms of seeing a response in 2 different tumor types in patients who really had little or no options left.
Thank you. Turning to the next question from Matthew, who asks, can you talk a little bit around your strategy of how you're going to generate revenue?
So in terms of revenue, the way that, biotech generally works is we are looking to, develop programs and then license them out into pharma companies, but also bring in revenue from collaborations like we've done with MSD. So it's really a 2-pronged approach. On the one hand, generating sufficient clinical data in a phase 2 program and attracting a licensing deal for the program as it moves into phase 3, or working on more research collaborations like we've done with Merck. And I think one of the interesting aspects about, for example, working with Merck in Keytruda and research collaboration, we started out, talking to Merck about oncology. And that's when we started the Keytruda program. And then thereafter, they started to ask us questions about the microbiome, where we thought it could go. And that's how we developed into the vaccine program. So, with that, for example, when we talked about the asthma data early on in the year, so obviously we got interest from respiratory companies who are working in the asthma area. And that's not only led to conversations about asthma, but it's also led to conversations about how we could use that product, for example, in related conditions like atopic dermatitis, but also what else we understand from addressing other autoimmune conditions. So that's how we'll generate revenue and income, and that's what we're looking for from a commercial point of view.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Turning to a question from Chris, who asks, and apologies if I pronounce this incorrectly. Hi, Duncan. Any update on Blautix?
So in terms of Blautix, we've been working with the FDA to understand how we can look at the next development and move that into a phase 3 study. The initial phase 2 data was both in IBS-C and IBS-D. So we've got to figure out, and when it goes into a phase 3 trial, it can only be in one of those disease conditions. So IBS is a disease which you either have IBS-C, constipation, IBS-D, diarrhea, or actually there's a third disease called IBS-M where you can alternate between the two, and there's no approved therapies for IBS-M, and actually it's not actually recognized as a disease by the FDA, which is actually where we'd like to focus. So it's just working with the FDA to look at the endpoints and how we can take that into an approval study.
Thank you. Turning to Bill, who talks about the US and why has performance not been so good in the US?
I think that's a great question. I think if I knew the answer to that, I probably should be working in the financial markets rather than biotech. I think the general decline that we saw in the US biotech markets happened pretty much as the time we were entering NASDAQ. When we're doing the NASDAQ transaction, there was quite a lot of froth in the marketplace, and we didn't understand that would lead to the decline that we've seen. And a lot of the US healthcare funds are really focusing in on their portfolio and what they've got, as opposed to looking for new names. And John, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely, Duncan. I mean, what we're seeing here in the US and biotech in particular is just sort of that downswing from what you've seen in the last few strong years, right? And looking at companies that have come over via SPAC, it's been a challenging year since 2020 and 2021. And I think you're absolutely right in the sense that when we speak to institutional investors, a lot of them are looking to put their money where they've already put their money, right? To continue that, to go into those investments and dig a little bit further. So bringing in that additional or new capital from institutions is challenging in this environment right now, right? But it's certainly one where we believe in what the MOA that we have here, right, at 4D Pharma, the science that we're creating, and what we have the potential to deliver. So we're continuing that story, continuing to talk to these institutional investors. I think as you think about one way to work around a market like this is to have that flexible capital structure, which is exactly what we just talked about through this presentation. So being able to provide that to individual investors and also institutional investors certainly helps kind of pull a company like us kind of stand out a bit and have that flexibility to be able to run through in what is a difficult market. So.
Thanks very much, John. You mentioned a capital markets day. We've got a question here from Kevin who says, do you have a date on that capital markets day that you mentioned?
I do. I can't exactly remember. I can't remember exactly what it is. John, is it the second week in September?
Yeah, we're looking at the later half of the year, so the second half of the year, probably mid of the second half, which would be September, October timeframe.
And that day we will talk about just a little bit more context. We want to give a little bit more color on the MSD project, how that worked, but also how that project evolved from the research that we're doing and where we think that research takes us next as well. Because a lot of the times there's a lot of focus on what's going on in the clinic, which is actually research that we did 4 or 5 years ago, and actually there's a lot of new research as well, which is interesting and is the next generation of live biotherapeutics. So we really want to get that out there and talk about the strength of research as well.
Thank you very much indeed. What do you see as the greatest challenge to delivering on your ambitions?
John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that's probably appropriate. Obviously, it's financing, right? That's what we are. We're a biotech company. That's how we fund our initiatives, right? And that's how we get to our milestones, is by bringing in capital. So clearly, that's where we fall into this conversation of requesting the additional allotment of shares to provide that flexibility, to create the opportunity for us to establish financing, right? And have that opportunity to be able to get different variants of financing that are available to us. And that's key for me on my side.
And just from my point of view, I think when Alec and I started this business, we just developed a drug which is called Fintepla, which is the drug which UCB bought off Zoogenics, who we sold it to. And that drug was a fantastic drug, but it did have issues around its safety profile. Worked really well, and actually the issues around safety sort of eventually proved out to be unfounded. So, the greatest challenge for us is getting through the clinical trial process to show that we can use the microbiome to deliver drugs which are safe, innovative, and do treat serious disease. And I think we are getting there. Progress is slower than we hoped. I think that's a constant frustration that I have in terms of clinical development. But we're trying to resolve it. We're pushing through it. But at the end of the day, I think out of all the stuff that I've seen, whether it been as an investor or in the venture industry, the opportunity within the microbiome is huge, and I still believe that. And there's a lot of education to do.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. If I can turn to a question from Ian. Actually, sorry, no, we've done that one. Okay, so we have one here from Chris, if I may. When will we hear more about Merck vaccine collaboration, specifically if it will trigger a milestone payment? Also, will they get any funding from the Michael J. Fox Foundation for any Parkinson collaboration?
Yeah, a good question. So, the Merck project, and we'll be more specific in autumn. So there's different stages that we need to go through in terms of how that project develops. We're pretty comfortable with what we've been able to deliver to Merck. Merck will go through their processes and look at what we've delivered, and they will make that decision about whether that triggers milestone payments or not. I think there's been a huge amount of learning from both Merck and 4D Pharma. It's a really innovative program. So we'll see. I'm pretty confident about what we've learned and what we've delivered. So, but Merck need to get comfortable with that and work through it.
That's great. Thank you, Duncan. Obviously, we received quite a considerable amount of questions around certain topics, which obviously we're going to review, and post this meeting, we'll transcribe the Q&A and publish any additional responses where it is, of course, appropriate for the company to do so. But at this time,
Mark, are you still there?
Yep. Can you hear me, Duncan? Duncan, can you hear me? Okay. John, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. I can hear
perfect.
you.
Sorry, I think we've just.
John, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So, Duncan, I'm just John, I'm just very mindful that we've got a number of questions that are on the same topic that we can address after today's call. And perhaps if I could just ask you, Duncan, just for a few closing comments to wrap up with, and then, as I say, we'll redirect investors to give you feedback post today's call.
John, do you want to go first, and then I'll just give a general overview at the end?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, look, I want to thank everyone for the time this morning, and Duncan, appreciate you doing this walkthrough. I think it's helpful to hear from the company here, 4D, and the challenges that we're facing in this current marketplace. And we've put a lot of the structure in place already, right? Essentially, we've filed the shelf on the U.S. markets. We filed a $150 million registration shelf that allows us to access different styles of equity, right, available in the marketplace. And that was step one, and for us. And step two, is for us to continue on to achieving the milestones that we've outlined here, right? Particularly, I think it was around slide 4 or 5 with respect to where we'd like to be with 518 Keytruda, as well as even with, with asthma and a few of the other assets that we're working with. And then, as we mentioned, the biggest challenge around us is specifically around being able to have that availability, right, for us to go out and finance in this heavily structured market and be able to deliver on those milestones as a result of that.
Thanks, John. And I think just to talk about 4D and what I think from a personal perspective, I can understand a lot of the investors' frustrations with the share price. I can understand a lot of the frustrations around, what is perceived to be in terms of how the board of directors is acting and looking at remuneration. And I understand that frustration, particularly in these marketplaces, particularly with the share price where it is. Do I think the share price reflects the platform and the clinical development? No, I don't. And I think we've got to work through, as John said, work through this challenging period. We've got to work through to develop the potential in the platform, and in the pipeline. Because at the end of the day, if you look at where we've taken this company from, in terms of the concept of the microbiome to giving patients an additional 2 years, is an amazing achievement. And I think we have to, from my perspective, I've got to thank the staff at 4D Pharma. They've done an amazing job, and they'll continue to do that to develop on the potential that we've got. So understand the frustrations from the shareholder perspective. I think we've got to look at the longer term. We've got to look at the potential that we've got. This is the best opportunity I've seen, and I think the Fintepla product sold for 1.6 billion a couple of weeks ago, and this far exceeds what that can do. So thanks for listening. Thanks for asking the questions. Thanks to Mark at Investor Meets Company. We look forward to working with them again, and hopefully using this platform to keep people updated. And thanks for listening.
That's great. John, Duncan, thank you very much indeed for updating investors this morning. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as we'll now ask you to complete your feedback form, where you'll be redirected very shortly. On behalf of the management team of 4D Pharma, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, and may I wish you all a very pleasant morning. Thank you.